Would you advocate that the quote unquote black community, African American community of today, start referring to themselves as Moorish?
I certainly would advocate it, but the thing is, to properly advocate it, one needs to really understand what it is. One of the greatest discoveries coming out of what we know as Black psychology or African-centered psychology is that in most cases, the Black mind or Black folks are suffering from an identity crisis in ways that most of the communities haven't.
It's evident that he cares. What do you care about? Welcome to the Rock Newman Show. It's the Rock Newman Show.
Quick story that kind of is reminiscent of this. Years ago, when I was finishing my doctorate, and the late great Dr. Ivan Van Sertima had asked me to.
I clap when I hear that name.
Yes, oh yeah, right. Every person who's serious about clarity around African and world history even should know the name of the late Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who taught both at Princeton and Rutgers universities. He had asked me to participate in a workshop that was held in Ohio for teachers of social studies. And I had just finished writing my chapter on Moorish Spain that was published in the Golden Age of the Moor that he had edited. And I gave this lecture to these, and not just lecture, a workshop to what was a predominantly Caucasian or quote unquote white group of teachers. And I talked about the impact and the influence of the Moors on the rise of the university system and the improvements in technology and the economy, etc., that takes place in Europe, and the impact upon the lineage, if you will, the genetic lineage of European peoples who were then in contact with the Moors, who, by the way, were not just in Spain and Portugal, but would be in areas of France, were in Italy, were in Crete during the Islamic era or period. And when I finished my presentation and then got the teachers into a dialogue in terms of helping them with what sources they should use and how to approach it, etc., there was a teacher who was, for all intent and purposes, he looked like a quote unquote white man, someone who was predominantly European. In fact, at the time I said he looked like Tom Selleck in terms of his phenotype. And this teacher said, my grandparents had talked about our Moorish ancestry, that we were of Moorish descent. And he got looks from his colleagues as it was almost like a confession. It just kind of came out.
Yeah.
And I said, and I've said several times subsequently, it was like he had committed, racial suicide.
Yeah.
Because he had just told his colleagues that essentially, certainly in their mind, they then saw him now as a black person. Right. And it was very courageous for him to do that. Right. Whether it was a knee-jerk reaction that he resented later, I have no idea, because I was just there to do the workshop and I left.
Yeah.
But the point is that when people know the truth, the complete truth about our history, not simply what African people endured under chattel slavery, not simply our history as victims of European domination, but our history pre-enslavement under what's usually referred to as the asiento, or the enslavement trade that would be established by the Spanish and would involve the Portuguese and then subsequently other European nations. When that is known, then folks feel much more comfortable with saying, I feel comfortable with embracing that. That, oh goodness gracious, it'll come to Carol Channing. You familiar with Carol Channing?
Carol Channing, sure.
Did you know that before she passed?
My Fair Lady?
Yes.
Yeah.
She came out and talked about her African-American ancestry.
I heard a little bit about it. I didn't.
And the reason,
right.
And I was just going to say, the reason I would argue that you don't is because even when these things come out, people run from it as fast as possible, because the prospect is then people begin to question who they are, right? In other words, here it came out. Carol Channing came out and talked about this, and then it went right out the window. Steve Tyler, who was the lead singer for Journey, he's retired now, found out that one of his ancestors is African American. Right? His daughter, Liv Tyler, talked about it. I think it was on Dr. Gates or Skip Gates' program. But then it's there and then it's gone. And then the last important point, something, again, I was talking about 30 years ago, when I was saying to my audiences, when I would speak at different schools or institutions or in my own classes, and I said, folks, look at coats of arms, the coats of arms that define that explain the surnames of people. Now, this is largely within the context of the European world, right? For obvious reasons, because most African societies would not have what we know as coats of arms. The coat of arms concept is largely coming out of Western Europe, particularly things like Herald's College in Britain. Well, when you're looking at a coat of arms for the family surname of Moore, and you see an African in the coat of arms. When you look at a coat of arms with the name Morrison, which means son of the Moor, in the coat of arms. When you look at the family name of Moorman or Mormon or Moroni, and you see in the coat of arms an African, that's telling you something about the lineage. Again, I wasn't the first to talk about that. It was J.A. Rogers in the 20th century, early 20th century, who first pointed it out. But Brother Rock, it never seemed to really catch on. But that's because the agenda of the educational system, as Woodson pointed out years ago, was not really to encourage true know thyself. It was meant to create a particular outcome that would support division, separation, self-hatred, self-aggrandizement beyond reason, right? The whole caste system, as I call it, the caste system of white supremacy that will become so much a part, unfortunately, of our society.
The perpetuation of insanity.
Yeah.
You know what? Given your examples, I want to share something that's a micro example, a microcosm of the big picture you just painted, and about the effects on self-esteem, the sense of superiority, and all of that happened with me personally. I, from a youngster, as a light-skinned black, if you will.
Yeah.
My attraction has always been to more dark-skinned women, and not at all to Caucasian women. So I'm going to give you try to shorten this, two quick examples about how this whitewashing and the propaganda of white supremacy has affected all segments of society. So there was an event in Houston where a lot of celebrities were around the pool, and primarily black guys. And there was a Caucasian lady that walked by, and all the guys doing what guys do, talk like, oh man, that's gonna be me. And so, it kind of got a little competitive thing going on. And I'll just say it this way. I was the lucky one, if you will. And we had a really great time. And this lady had a really, really swinging from the chandeliers good time. She saw me 2 days later, after these last couple of evenings of having a good time, sitting with Sugar Ray Leonard and his brothers and some of the people from his camp. This is at the Houston Astrodome Village. She saw me sitting with them. And that evening, when we were getting ready to try to have a good time again, she said, I saw you. I said, who were those guys you were talking to? I said, they're my friends. She said, you got a lot of nigga friends. So, I had a jacked up choice to make of sorts, of to continue that good time or to make a statement. So my statement was, have you ever had a good time like this with a nigga? She said, my father, what are you talking about? My father would kill me. I would never do something so disgusting. And I said, you have for the last couple of nights. Now, what are you talking about? I said, I'm a nigga, according to your terminology. She said, whatever. So I got out my driver's license and showed it to her. My Maryland driver's license had, black, white, whatever, and it
right.
was,
That's
and
right.
it was black. She burst into tears, grabbed her stuff, and ran from the room.
Wow.
That is so disgusting. Okay, white lady. A year later or so, I meet someone who was a Philadelphia Eagles cheerleader, black lady. within a couple of weeks, she had decided we were soulmates and we should set a wedding date. I mean, man, it was like that.
Mm.
I went to, you remember the Congressman, Perrin Mitchell from Baltimore, Maryland congressman. I went to his nephew's wedding in Atlantic City, who was held at this Jewish guy's place. And it was predominantly Black people there because there was 2 Black people getting married. And so when we were driving back to the Philadelphia area from Atlantic City, she said, you know, you seem to know a lot of Black people. I said, you don't know that I'm Black? She's like, you pull my leg, you know, whatever.
Wow.
And to shorten that story, I'll just tell you this.
Wow.
It went from her encouragement for us to set a date to be married when it was revealed to this Black lady that I wasn't a Caucasian. She wanted nothing else to do with me. Wow. And so that you're talking about right now is something that it's pervasive.
Yes.
Macro level, Lord knows, and so much so on a micro level. Nothing about me changed in either situation, but what they brought, their preconceived notions, in both cases, made me a disgusting person because neither of them, I wasn't what either of them thought. But the me person, nothing changed. And so it just, you know, I don't want to take too much of the time because I got some more questions for you. I got some more time that I'd like to hear you, you know, share. But I wanted to share that because I think that's somewhat of a microcosm of a real example of what we're talking about, of what has been the effects of this insanity of white supremacy, but his success in promoting and infiltrating the minds of everyone.
Of everybody. Yeah. If we want to use the color, I mean, if we want to use the color analogies of everybody, Black, brown, yellow, red, white, any community of people who has been infected with constructs of racism, largely rooted in what we call white supremacy or global Eurocentric hegemony. Everybody who's fallen under that environment will, unless they have something to counter it, will end up feeling and thinking that way. Look, I have my mom and my aunt my late aunt shared a story of one of our cousins who was very light in complexion and had gone overseas from her home to study, and she met, I think this gentleman was Scottish. She married this Scottish gentleman, and then she kind of stopped communicating with the family. Now, this would have been the equivalent of like a great aunt or a cousin. So this was some decades. In fact, I think it might have been before I was even born, or I would have been a baby. But my mom said that she married him and didn't communicate anymore. And her sister, meaning this cousin's sister, or this aunt's sister, showed up at the doorstep because they were living in Canada.
My Lord.
And knocked on the door. And this Scottish gentleman opened the door and said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Good afternoon. I'm here to see my sister." And her phenotype, her physical features were more demonstratively African
Mm-hmm.
in appearance
Mm-hmm.
than her sister. And her sister, when she came to the door, because the husband called her, she about fainted
Yeah.
because she had just had her cards exposed
Yeah.
with regard trying to hide who she was. Now, this was, like I said, probably 60 years ago, or maybe a little more. But to the credit of her husband, he didn't care.
Mm.
But in her own mind, now
Yeah.
mind you, this was in Canada.
Yeah.
So Canada is even, I'm not saying there's no racism in
Yeah.
Canada,
Yeah.
but as you know, historically, Canada was seen as less anti-Black or anti-African
Yeah.
than the history of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So, they remained together until they both made their transition, passed away. So that's something that I, am familiar with as well, more indirectly in terms of what you've just conveyed. Yeah.
So I have a list here that I kind of want to see if we can have you to address in sort of rapid fire. I always tell my guests, like I said to you, don't ever feel a need to rush. But I'd like to do this in a more rapid fire fashion. Is the Moorish identity more about a glorious past or a necessary future?
It's definitely more about a necessary future, because what's the purpose of simply living in the past? It's kind of that, like I've said multiple times, if one only studies history as a self-congratulatory narrative, as Dr. Milena Karenga has often called it, what are you learning from that? The only thing you learn from seeing how, quote unquote, great you were in the past is how great you were in the past. Can you utilize that knowledge to create a better present and future? The benefit of seeing your greatness as a woman or man of a particular community or what have you is it reminds you of your internal potential. But the internal potential is then to be activated so you can use it. You then move through the world with a greater knowledge of your capacity to do great things, a greater desire, if you have any kind of real, knowledge of society and the world, a greater desire to be ethical, to be as ethical and decent a person as you can. In the context of Moorish science, for example, the Moorish Science Temple, the founder and the prophet referred to the tenets of love, truth, peace,
Noble Drew Ali.
Noble Drew Ali. That's right, brother. Noble Drew Ali. Love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. And you can't get to justice until you begin with truth. So even the structure of it, love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice, is like, it means I always engage everyone and everything with love, and then truth, and a respect and desire for peace, and a respect for freedom. Then you get to justice. You can't have justice if you have no love. That's insane, right? So the whole idea is to produce, through the study of history, a better person, a better, a more ethical, a more kind, productive, empathetic, empathy person. So when I'm studying history, when I study the Moors and I'm looking at the different communities, I don't hate any people. That's irrational. I don't hate Europeans. Certainly don't hate Native Americans or Asians. That's also insane. What one has contempt for are the actions of peoples from those respective groups. There's a saying, if you want to find God, look within. If you want to find the devil, look within. Because both those things are present within you. The question is which one you choose to dominate your actions in the world. That's what will determine really whether you are closer to what Christian community might say, closer to Christ, or closer to the prescription given by the Arab prophet Muhammad, or Musa, or Confucius, or Buddha. Peace be upon all of them for having tried to give a prescription for being better human beings, right? So it's definitely about the future. It's not simply about the past.
I got to follow up with this question here. Let me know if it's a tough question for you, but whether it is or not, I would appreciate it if you would give me your answer. As accomplished as you are in the history of the Moors, the community of, call it what you will, we were colored. I guess first you start, we were niggas, colored, Negro, Black, African American. I don't know if you've ever heard Smokey Robinson's poetry about that, about, you know, why we have all these different names.
I have not Smokey Robinson's, no.
Look there.
I'll look that up.
Smokey's take on, you know, the names that we're called.
Right.
Would you advocate that the quote unquote Black community, African American community of today, start referring to themselves as Moorish?
I certainly would advocate it, but the thing is, to properly advocate it, one needs to really understand what it is. One of the greatest discoveries coming out of what we know as Black psychology or African-centered psychology is that in most cases, the Black mind or Black folks are suffering from an identity crisis in ways that most of the communities haven't. When you talked about, and I've talked about this multiple times, people jumping from colored to Negro to Afro-American to American Negro to African American, especially with Jesse Jackson, who is typically credited with having us in the late 80s begin to identify as African American, which I think was correct. It was wise. He was trying to remind us that our historical foundations are still coming primarily out of the African continent. And there are people who are trying to make the case that, well, no, but we're different because we forged a new relationship, a new identity and relationship with a society. So I actually use that by being in the Americas. But that never made any sense to me, because if you still are predominantly part of the African world, and especially now we can do DNA tests, and you can literally identify what African ethnic group and what region of Africa you're from, why would you want to distance yourself from that unless you are really uncomfortable with yourself? You don't have self-knowledge. You don't have a proper, healthy sense of self, your identity. Consequently, you try to run from it.
You know, I don't want to leave this camera without sharing with all of my friends, family, and everyone out in the Rock Newman Show 2.0 universe the matter of Juanita's remedy. It is a lotion. It is a body emollient. It is something so wonderful. My wife is a happy woman these days, and she shared it with her friends, and they're beyond happy. You gotta get Juanita's remedy. Get it, and you will thank me.
What was his name? T. Thomas Fortune. T. Thomas Fortune, who was a light complexioned as well, as I understand. He wasn't able to so-called pass, but even he had a problem with people calling themselves Negro and not identifying themselves as Afro-American. There was a recognition of the need to identify oneself with an African origin. Just as most Asian Americans, even though they've never seen Japan or never seen China, been in the US for 100 plus years, still identify with that. Now, people will say, well, that's because they didn't have their culture taken away. You're right. It's not identical. They didn't have their culture taken away in the way that enslaved Africans did. But you are now in a new period, a new era. I just said, you can learn your identity. You can discover your identity through research. The designation of Moorish specifically had to do with, obviously, the Moorish Science Temple that Drew Ali establishes in the 1920s. Some people claim that, there was no justification for that. He was kind of making it up, which again is equally unfair to him because he was drawing from a legitimate identity for people of predominant African ancestry. Dictionaries, coats of arms, literary writings, etc., within the Western world, all understood that when you said Moorish, you were talking about somebody of predominant African ancestry. It can also be used, the term Moorish, from the perspective of being a descendant of those who came from within the Moorish Empire. That's a longer discussion. That's something that I seek to address in my book, Othello's Children in the New World, and will also, in subsequent writing, say more about because of additional research. But you can use that in terms of the boundaries of the old Moorish Empire, which at one time encompassed territory that went as far south as the Senegal River and as far east, almost to the border of what we know as Egypt today. So those borders, people who came from within those borders, were understood by European nations who'd made treaties. Let me be very specific, because we're talking about based upon treaties between the Moorish Empire of 200 years ago and the European nations like Britain and France, etc. So one can specifically identify anybody from within those borders of the Moorish Empire. Dahiru, historian named Dahiru Yahya, who talked about the Moorish boundaries, again, the boundaries of the Moorish Empire being that broad, which also helps one to understand why Drew Ali would talk about the connection to Morocco as part of the Moorish Science Temple, although Morocco was a small portion. That's the current territory, the Kingdom of Morocco, that was once part of larger territorial boundaries. So, in short, yes, African Americans or Black people can, and I would say should, utilize the term Moorish, but only after they've spent time researching it so that it becomes a defensible position.
Yeah.
Don't just latch on to it because you don't want to be designated as black or
Mhm.
some other term.
Mhm.
That's why, in large measure, I wrote the book Othello's Children in the New World, although the primary focus was to the Moorish Science Temple of America community, so that people would have some clarity to prove the historicity, the authenticity of Drew Ali's argument. He didn't just pull this out of a hat.
Yeah.
And even the research that I'm doing now for this subsequent book that will be coming out, is extending this awareness, right, to a broader audience about the connection to the
I have
Moorish identity.
I certainly had more. I have more. Um, Again,
Questions?
no pun intended, but rapid fire. But this brings me to another point. I'm gonna step off of that page of questions for a second, because all you just said brings me here. Currently existing throughout much of social media in our community is what I see as an aggressive division of thought and vitriol, unfortunately, with much vitriol. And that is a segment of our population that is referred to themselves as foundational Black Americans, and a segment that continues to be Pan-Africanist. And it's a rabid debate that has just spilled over into ugliness.
Mhm.
If you would please share your thoughts on that.
The idea of identifying oneself strictly as Black American, to the extent that they don't want to acknowledge a kinship with the broader African world, is problematic for me for two reasons. Well, for a few reasons, but one of the first ones is I don't understand the need to decouple from your bloodline connection to people in the African world, especially when it's who you are. So the question that one has to ask themselves, I would say again, if they are associating themselves with that designation, is, are you doing this because you don't have any respect for or pride in your deeper African origins, or are you doing this for some other reason? Rock, I can tell you, I've heard many times over the years from a lot of folks who identified as Black American tell me how they don't like certain continental Africans or certain people from the West Indies because of them saying that the continental Africans have an arrogance, or the continental Africans don't respect who they are. And again, we began our conversation at the beginning talking about the psychological impact upon our sense of identity that would encourage division in order to prevent any meaningful change. If one wants to say, well, we have greater rights to our U.S. citizenry, our rights and privileges on the basis of being foundational. We have our roots, in fact, that are colonial. They're even, not just the United States, but they're colonial era. In fact, we could even say, if we wanted to go deeper, there are ancient connections between the continents that most people don't address. But that's another conversation in the interest of time. I don't understand. I don't understand it other than to say these are individuals who have to ask themselves. I can't answer this for them. They have to go inside their own minds. They got to reflect in their own hearts and ask, are they doing this because they have a contempt for a part of themselves? Or are they doing this because they see this as a political strategy, right? In other words, it's like they just want to decouple from continental Africans, other people and newcomers for political reasons. But I don't, my view would be that's not a good strategy. I would say you can still, or you should still acknowledge, yes, my ancestry is coming out of West Africa or coming out of Northwest Africa or what part, central, whatever part of the continent. But I feel the need to emphasize the rights of the more indigenous Americans. And here's the reason. But I still don't think it's a good strategy. Dr. Diop, when he was talking about Egypt, for example, he said, until, and I'm paraphrasing, but until, I said, African history remain suspended in air until Egypt is reconnected with African history, the legacy of African history. And I would say you can only know yourself, right? The ancient Kemites, followed by the Greeks, followed by the Romans, all said, know thyself. Well, thyself means the entirety of yourself, the entirety of yourself. So I think it was Malcolm X who said to somebody who denied their connection to the African world, so they were just a Negro because they were born here. And he said, if a cat has kittens inside of an oven, are they biscuits? The reality is you're a person of African ancestry born in the Americas. If anything, it might make more sense to say that you're American Africans if you want to highlight your American experience. Now that's just my perspective. But this is something that I don't see as productive for the greater good. And if we think one other point from history, what did Marcus Garvey try to do? He's often caricatured and misrepresented for a back to Africa movement, as if the man was saying everybody should get on boats and go back to the African continent. That's nonsense. But the continuation of that misrepresentation is deliberate. He was talking about a psychological, cultural return to one's knowledge of their African ancestry.
Yeah.
Just as any self-respecting, healthy Asian brother or sister, or healthy European brother or sister would be looking at their own origins and say, I am still a Welshman or an Irishman born in the Americas, even though I've been here 200 years.
Gil Scott Heron, the great poet, said the revolution ain't going to be televised. And ultimately what he was talking about, that it was going to be in here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, as I said earlier, I'm motivated by love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. That obviously means love. I already say charity begins in home. I love African peoples. I love all people. I love humanity. But charity begins at home means I have to first help in assisting my own home, my own most immediate community with coming into a healthier sense of identity. But it doesn't mean then that I'm going to have to deny my connection to my Welsh or my Irish or Portuguese or Spanish or whatever other European ancestral links are there. I take the good and the bad. If you're a rational person, this is just me, and I've been healthy, you know that your ancestry represents good and bad. All peoples did something good and bad. You're not highlighting the negative if you have any sense, but you're not also lying about your identity in terms of, another quick point. And I know you've had this experience, I'm sure. People who will overemphasize the European ancestry because they don't want to be associated with African ancestry. That's very different than what I'm saying, where you still acknowledge the value of Irish ancestry or what have you, German, whatever it is, even as you know that people who were Irish did evil things to African people, even as you know Germans or whomever did it. That's just rational. That's just reasonable. But what you don't do is run from your African heritage. You talked about your experience, Brother Rock, as someone who was light complexioned. People sometimes would look at me and wonder, well, you could have disappeared just into the Latino or the Cuban American community, because my father was born in Cuba. And my name, obviously. No, because I value my African ancestry. And I see the importance of emphasizing that, even to those in the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking world, so that they too will begin to research the history of Los Moros, the Moors, and embrace that and say it's part of who I am. I'm not trying to run from my African ancestry. I'm not color-struck like so many people in the Spanish-speaking communities and Portuguese-speaking communities have been. But I get it. It's because of the miseducation.
Yes.
And so
I'm in Panama as we speak right now. A week or so ago, I was in Mexico, and it's just so utterly prevalent. So utterly prevalent. I've got a couple of more rapid fire questions, if you will.
okay.
If you could discover or recover just one lost scroll from the libraries of Moorish Spain, what subject would you hope it covers?
I can say unequivocally, it would be anything that addresses the fact that there were African and Asiatic people, Muslims, in the pre-Columbian Americas. That would be probably at the top of the list.
And if Ivan Van Sertima was still here, he will be so happy that you recovered that.
Yes. Yes.
What is the simple best medicine for the Othello complex you describe in your book?
Know thyself. Know thyself, meaning spend some time learning about the Moorish African legacy in Western history. Spend time in deep reflection about how you think. What do you see when you look at yourself? Do you see somebody who's inferior because of African or indigenous ancestry? Do you see someone who is at peace, who is content with their identity, their collective identity? It doesn't mean perfection. Everybody is working on something. Some people don't like the fact that they're too short or think they're too heavy or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the damage that's been done by the devaluation of African lineage. And then if somebody says, well, there's so much in African history that shows what they deem as a lack of technologies that they equate with greater civil and all that. And as I've said multiple times, you can be a highly technological, uncivilized society. Civilization has more to do with ethics and balance, empathy. It's not technology in terms of, advanced technologies, right? That's the problem. So someone looks at examples of African kingdoms and says, yeah, but that's not like the equivalent of ancient Greece. And that's their most direct lineage. Well, but because it's not the equivalent of, say, ancient Kemet or ancient Kush, doesn't mean that it doesn't have value, right? And one other very important point. This is the issue again with using collective terms like, white. I had a classmate when I was working on my master's in history. And this young lady, and I'm going to say sister for reasons that will become apparent, but she was Greek. But she was very dark complexion Greek young woman. And we were in a class, a history class, Western civilizations. And one of the other students said, well, we're really proud of our ancient Greek ancestors. We are as whites identifying, I'm so proud of that. To which she raised her hand and asked him what his name was. And his name was a British name. Mm-hmm. And she said, what connection do you have to ancient Greece in terms of your lineage, your bloodline, right? And it caused all confusion. And it was like, well, of course, the ancient Greeks were white and we're white. And she said, who told you the ancient Greeks were white? The ancient Greeks were part of the Mediterranean. This happened to be a young woman who was Greek, who knew Greece's interaction with Africa and with Western Asia, right? And she was pointing out the fallacy of the purity that's associated with whiteness, and raising this issue again about, wait a minute, well, you have people identify the collective umbrella term of white, who then see their ancestors as coming out of ancient Greece. And then these are the same people who often ask why Black people see an association with ancient Egypt, right? So, well, the phenotype. All right, well, if we're talking about phenotype, just phenotype, well, yes, people who are defined as white, you could find phenotypes of people who would have been fair, or say lighter or paler in complexion, living in what would have been the Greek city-states of antiquity. Just as you will find phenotypes associated with people defined as Black in ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. So it's this idea of using, white as an umbrella term to present superiority through the ages, through the centuries, through the millennia, is not usually afforded or allowed to people who are now going under the moniker of Black, saying there were people who look like me, a dark complexioned African or African American woman in antiquity. It doesn't mean, and this is so important too, Rock, you bring this up, because you may know about the rift that's going on in Egypt today, with a lot of Egyptians resenting Black Americans or African Americans from saying they have an association with ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
And that's because they don't understand, I would argue, how most African Americans who are thinking critically are making the association. They're not saying they just got off the plane or a few generations removed from the Arab Republic of Egypt. What they're saying is, my phenotype is a phenotype that can be found among the ancient peoples of Kemet that have roots in Nubia, that have roots in the southernmost part, or certainly the eastern parts of the African continent. But again, all this requires that we think that and I hate to say this, and you may know this from your own experience, too many of people in general are not encouraged to study history from, I would say, primary sources first and foremost when you can get them, and to then reflect on its relevance to what's going on. So
I couldn't agree more. And, you know, when you say that, I just think about people that are close to me that I know don't want to, as they would say, go down that rabbit hole, because the truth that might be found in that rabbit hole would make them too uncomfortable from the position that they've arrived at through this whole propaganda and miseducation.
Yes.
Lastly, I want to ask you this. When people look back at your work 100 years from now, what is the one truth you hope they never forget?
The one truth. That they are an expression of the Creator, that they are essentially an expression of what we know as the divine, and that it's up to them to make sure that their expression has been one highlighting the higher self rather than the lower self. So it's this awareness, you know, in the context.
That's so fundamentally sound, brother. That's so
Right.
fundamentally sound.
Right.
Thank you.
That awareness. Because again, this goes back to why would I choose to even study history? Why did the best, I would argue, of the intellectual traditions of the world emphasize this study of the past, which is actually not completely the past, because the past is what shapes the present and then essentially lights the way to the future. The purpose of studying history, to me, is to reconnect with what we might call the divine and the higher aspects of that. The higher self, which is referred to, at least in Moorish teachings, Moorish sciences, the mother of the virtues and the harmonies of life. So the idea of emphasizing virtue and harmony to the best of your ability in order to create a better world here and beyond.
They say if you want to hide something from someone, put it in a book. This evening, Dr. José Pimienta Bey showed us that the pages have been open all along. We just had to know how to read them. I'm Rock Newman, and this has been the Rock Newman Show 2.0. Knowledge is the first step towards sovereignty. To my beloved viewers, I say good night, and I'll see you the next time.